Fifth graders, today we're going to be developing a deeper understanding of what we're reading by determining the author's main idea and our own ideas about the text in order to become more knowledgeable about the topic. We did a little bit of this last week without actually giving it a name, so today we're going to practice it again, but you're going to have the name to go with it today. Okay, we're going to be using the section, "The Shot Heard Round the World." So I'm going to read it to you first, and then I'm going to show you in my journal what we're doing. The Redcoats marched all night, a distance of 16 miles. When they reached Lexington at dawn on April 19, 1775, they found a ragged line of Minutemen drawn up to the village green. "Ye villains, ye rebels, disperse! Lay down your arms!" shouted Major John Pitcairn, the British officer. Suddenly, a shot rang out. Nobody knows which side fired it. This was the first shot of the Revolutionary War. It is known as the shot heard round the world. Now all the redcoats raised their muskets and blazed away. When the smoke cleared, 8 Minutemen were dead, and 10 wounded. The rest ran for cover. The redcoats gave 3 cheers. Then they wheeled around and marched off to Concord. In the center of town, they chopped down the Liberty Pole and burned it. Smoke billowed into the air. Meanwhile, Minutemen had been gathering on a hill beyond the stream. When they saw the rising smoke, they thought the British were setting fire to the town. They raced toward the bridge that crossed the stream. The redcoats fired a volley across the water, and 2 Americans were killed. "Fire, fellow soldiers, for God's sakes, fire!" shouted the American commander, Major John Buttrick. A volley rang out from the Americans. Seconds later, 3 redcoats were dead, and 1 was dying. At least 10 more were wounded. The rest quickly retreated. The redcoats formed columns and began marching back to Lexington. But the Minutemen took a shortcut. They were waiting in ambush on both sides of the narrow road. Muskets blazed from behind the stone wall. Barns, bushes, and houses. As the redcoats marched on, the Minutemen ran ahead, took up new positions, and fired again. The terrified redcoats began to run. They dashed into Lexington and flung themselves on the ground, gasping for breath. They were lucky. A British officer, Lord Percy, had just arrived with 1,000 fresh troops. These new arrivals held off the Minutemen while the exhausted soldiers rested. Then they began the long march back to Boston. It was a nightmare. All along the route, Minutemen shot at them from ambush. It was dark by the time they finally staggered into town and reached their barracks. This is Jonathan Harrington was one of the Americans killed on the green at Lexington. He managed to crawl to the doorway of his house, where his wife and son were watching in horror, before dying at their feet. Many British officers were wounded during the march back to Lexington. Their uniforms made them easy for the Minutemen to pick out. The commander of the British troops, Colonel Francis Smith, was a very fat man, was wounded in the leg, and he didn't dare get on a horse because he would be an easy target in the saddle. He had to limp along with his men. Okay, so now what we were going to do, which I said you had done a little bit of this last week, is we're going to do what's called a double journal entry. Okay, so we're using the text, "The Shot Heard Round the World." In the left-hand column, you're going to make notes of things from the text, and in the right-hand column, you're going to make notes of things from your mind. What are you thinking? Okay, so for example, on the left-hand side, you could take a portion of the passage that was important, interesting language that you came across, a quotation, key events, critical facts, could be the main idea, and you could also jot down problems or conflicts that occurred. And then from my mind side, you would write down your reactions to this section, theories or hypotheses that you have, a comparison between what we read and something else that we read, an explanation, a discussion of significance. Why was something that happened during this section, why was it important? And a discussion of reactions to the text. Okay. Okay, so I went ahead and filled in my chart, and some things that I came up with straight from the text was that a shot rang out, and they were not able to determine which side fired that shot, so I put who fired. I copied down the quote, "The shot heard round the world," because that did become a very famous quote. It is still used and heard today. This was the start of the Revolutionary War. Once that first shot happened, both sides began firing. They brought in new British troops. They said 1,000 new soldiers came in for the British, and the British were ambushed due to their red coats when they were marching back. So some things that I jotted down that I was thinking or reacting to was that there was probably confusion for both sides, especially when this first shot went out. Especially if you weren't right there in that particular area, you may not have known what was happening. Okay, and then of course I just wrote that this was a famous quote. At this point, both sides were getting killed. One side wasn't kind of standing out above the other as doing a better job. The men were becoming very tired at this point. And the red coats that the British were wearing did not play well in their favor, right? They were saying they were ambushed at night because the Americans could see them in the dark because of their bright red coats. So that did not play out well for them. Okay, so you guys are going to be practicing this work today. You're going to be reading a different section out of the book Liberty on your own. And then you are going to be creating a 2-column chart based off the section you are reading, which is titled 1 if by land, 2 if by sea.